My name is Shara Babcock. I serve Chautauqua as Vice President and Emily and Richard Smucker Chair for Education. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the Hall of Philosophy for the third and final session of the 2017 Middle East Update. Please turn off your cell phones so that I can conclude this afternoon's announcements. Chautauqua Institution is deeply committed to dialogue and understanding of the conflicts in the Middle East. Each summer, we provide a Middle East update, each with a different subject, in recognition of the importance of the search for a meaningful and lasting peace. How many of you have been to both the Monday and Tuesday sessions? And just one, if you've just been to one. So I will therefore provide just a brief introduction for those of you who are here for the first time today. Our partner in the Middle East Update is Dr. Geoffrey Kemp, Director of Regional Security Programs at the Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kemp has been updating us on foreign affairs for the past 23 years. Yesterday, we heard from Ghaith al-Omari, Senior Fellow in the Irvin Levy Family Program on U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship at the Washington Institute and former Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, speaking about the existential fears of the Palestinians. On Monday, we heard from Dr. Shai Feldman, the Judith and Sidney Swartz Director and co-chair of the Crown Belfer Middle East Project at Brandeis University, speaking and answering questions about the existential fears of the Israelis. Today, we welcome all three back to the platform to join in a discussion about how we might approach peace in the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, we may have a contract by 4:30 this afternoon. Please welcome back Drs. Kemp and Feldman and Mr. al-Omari.
I'm glad to see you all again, and as Shara said, this is the day when we reach decisions, and I'm going to be a sort of facilitator, but let me just sort of preface this by mentioning that unlike the Europeans and most of our brethren in the Americas, Donald Trump's victory in November was greeted with much enthusiasm in most of the Arab world and in Israel. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf, I think, welcomed the fact that they were getting the word that in the Trump administration there'd been no more focus on democracy, less focus on human rights. The Israeli government was joyous because Trump was not Obama. In the early days of the Trump administration, he visited the region and met with the key leaders and confirmed this good news. He also made very extravagant promises about the Arab-Israeli conflict and his ability as the man who knows the art of the deal to bring peace to the region. And he designated his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to be the chief U.S. facilitator. And it's against this background of great promise and 6 months to see what has happened so far that we've asked our two speakers to talk about the realistic prospects for peace, not by 4:30, but anytime soon. We've heard about the respective fears of both Palestinians and the Israelis. In those two talks that they gave, there was a number of references to the current situation, and there certainly were in the Q&A. But today, the focus is to be on the peace process, which we've been discussing here for many, many years. And how we're going to handle it's very simple. I'm going to ask Shai and Raif to open with about a 7 or 8 minute statement of their take on where we are right now. I will sort of take a back perch here on this stool, and I will be lower down so as not to eclipse their brilliance. And then after they've both made their 8-minute briefs, then I will try to get them to engage in some dialogue and see if there are any differences between these two remarkable people who have, I think, between them sort of spelt out some extraordinary truths about the region. And then, as usual, we will open up to questions on the right, on the left, line up behind the mics, ask questions, do not make speeches. And with that, let me conclude my introductory remarks and ask Shai to sit down and make your 8-minute presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming back. I'm amazed by the number of masochists here. I have to apologize to those of you that thought that the weekly pass includes a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The answer is no, and there's no refund. So what I'm going to try to do, if I don't collapse here with this chair, is to give you a snapshot of why I think we are in the paralysis that we are in, and save the more uplifting comments about the Trump administration to the Q&A. This doesn't seem to be working very well. Switch to...
Here, let me...
But that's all. Good.
Good.
So we teach a class at Brandeis called Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. And what we try to tell the students is that if you want to understand any development in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you have to answer for yourselves 4 questions. 1, what happened in the international arena that can explain that development? Secondly, what happened in the region that can explain that development? Third, what happened in the domestic politics of the protagonists, the Israeli domestic politics, the Palestinian domestic politics, and that can explain this development? And fourth, what's the role of individual leaders in explaining this development? Now, to understand why we are in the predicament that we are in, why are we in this paralysis that we're in, I find it best to compare the last few years to what I call the golden era of Arab-Israeli peacemaking. And there actually was a golden era of the Arab-Israeli peacemaking. That golden era was in the early 90s. You had, in a span of 3 years, 4 very dramatic developments. 1991, the Madrid conference that brought all the countries, most of the countries in the Middle East around this idea of peace. That followed something called the multilateral process. Very few people knew at the time and know now that for 2 or 3 years, Israel, the Palestinians, and 13 Arab countries were engaged in a whole set of negotiations and talks on regional security and arms control, on refugees, on economic development, on the environment, on natural resources, and so on. That ended around 1995. The 2 other developments was the Oslo breakthrough, the 3rd development, and the 4th, the peace treaty with Jordan. So how do you explain this golden era? Well, you have to answer these 4 questions. The reason we had these four dramatic developments is because the United States at the time, in the early 90s, just emerged from winning the Cold War. It was the only superpower, the only remaining superpower, and it could dictate much, including bringing the parties to the Madrid Peace Conference. At the regional level, the region just experienced the Gulf War. The US was very successful in putting together a very successful coalition that defeated Saddam Hussein and essentially reversed the invasion of Kuwait. The domestic politics, well, around the 1992 elections brought the Labour Party back to power and Rabin as prime minister. On the Palestinian front, I will let Rafe correct me, but we just had the first Palestinian Intifada, and there were two developments here. Number one, the first Palestinian Intifada actually threatened Arafat because it brought about an emergence of local leaders who were basically the spokesperson and the flag carriers of the first Intifada. And secondly, Arafat made one huge strategic mistake. He at least was perceived as having sided with Saddam Hussein during the Gulf crisis, which angered the Gulfies, which ended their financial support of the PLO, which brought the PLO to the verge of financial bankruptcy, without which you can't understand the concessions that the PLO made that allowed the Oslo agreement. So you had these very important domestic developments, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And you had, on the Palestinian side, Arafat, who's seen as a kind of a George Washington of the Palestinians. And on the Israeli side, you had a Rabin with impeccable security credentials from whom the Israelis could accept what they might not have accepted from other leaders. Okay? So all these developments, in a way you could say, all these stars, all these four stars were arrayed in the right direction, without which there would not have been this golden era. Now, what do we have now? We have a United States that's seen in the region as in retreat. The unipolar moment is over. The Russians are back. The Russians are challenging the US in a number of fronts, and Iran is challenging the United States in a number of fronts. The region, if you haven't heard enough depressing news about the region over the last 2 days, I can add some more, but I will spare you. In any case, we had at the time when we had Madrid, there was an Egypt, there was a Syria, there was an Iraq, and there was a Libya, and there was a Yemen. None of these countries exist now. So it's not surprising that the remaining regimes are totally focused now on their internal survival. And who do we have on the domestic front? Ray told you yesterday that Abu Mazen is not Arafat. And I'll tell you a state secret. Netanyahu is not Rabin. So if you want to understand why are we stuck now? Now on the Israeli, I'll just add one more thing on the Israeli front. On the Israeli front, I go back to Monday. Okay? On the Israeli front, my view is, we can get into extensive analysis, the problem with the domestic scene in Israel, as I said, is not the right wing. It's the fact that the center and the left of center are paralyzed. And as I said on Monday, they're paralyzed by fear. And unless this fear is addressed, we will remain in the present state of paralysis. And how do we address these fears is something that goes beyond the first 8 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so it's all yours, right?
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to address 3 questions. Is a deal possible? If not, what can be done? And what's the role of the United States? And I will try, since you generously gave me 8 minutes, to do it in 8 minutes. So by necessity, I will be very telegraphic, but I'm looking forward to kind of delving in deeper into things. Is a deal possible? The short answer is no. Not in the short term, at least. Not because for the lack of knowledge. We actually know by now what are the necessary concessions that need to be made by the leaders. Now, Shai and I might be able to agree on these things, but the problem is, to make these concessions, you need strong leaders, because these are very, very difficult concessions. Strong, legitimate leaders. And this is where things start falling apart. On the Israeli side, I will not go in depth enough to say that in the current Israeli government, only 4 ministers actually support a 2-state solution out of 20-some ministers. On the Palestinian side, and I went into that in depth yesterday, Abbas lacks legitimacy because of corruption, because of failure in the diplomatic front. Add to that, the Palestinians right now are going through a protracted succession process where Abbas, who is not young, nor does he lead a healthy lifestyle, is on his way out. We don't know who's going to come next. Everyone's positioning. That's not a time for people to be moderate and risk takers. Add to that, there is the split between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, one that I believe should not be resolved unless Hamas meets certain conditions, but anyways, one that in reality will not be resolved anytime soon. All of this has produced among Palestinians a sense of disbelief. Palestinians do not believe in their leaderships. Palestinians do not believe the Israelis and the Israeli sincerity. And by the way, that's mutual. The Israelis are in the same position. And ultimately, because of that, the Palestinians do not believe that a two-state solution is possible. In these circumstances, when President Trump talks about the ultimate deal is nowhere to be found, I believe. In this kind of situation, what do you do? In my view, first of all, you cannot ignore the situation. If you ignore it, it doesn't stay static. It goes down. We need to do action that actually meets these sources of disbelief. And in that, I would look at three fronts. First of all, I think there's a lot that can be done on the ground. Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and the Israelis have been working, the security services have been working very closely together to an extent that the Israeli security services now believe that you can actually lighten up in the West Bank, create economic opportunities, allow the Palestinians access to parts of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank, to which the Palestinians so far have had no access. These are the kind of things that will not resolve the conflict. But if these succeed, we can show the Palestinians that Israelis can do positive things and reverse the disbelief. And we can show the Israelis that Palestinians can be dependable partners if peace were to move forward. Second, we have to address the Palestinian lack of belief in their leaders. And that can only be done, in my view, if we engage in an effort to push the Palestinian Authority to reform itself. As President George W. Bush has shown, this is possible if we invest in it, and it will do a lot to increase the legitimacy of the leadership. Thirdly, there's the issue of Gaza. And while I believe that unity cannot be achieved and Hamas has to meet certain conditions, however, what's happening in Gaza is not only hitting Hamas. What we see, the blockade in Gaza, is actually affecting the people of Gaza. The situation is unlivable. No drinking water, no electricity, none of that things. This is wrong on a humanitarian level, and this is dangerous on a security level because this is what starts wars. So we have to deal with the issue of Gaza by addressing the humanitarian situation. And on a footnote on this one, there is an interesting effort happening now under Egyptian auspices to do something about it, and we can go further into this. Can the US lead? If this is the case, can the US lead? And here the US actually had some assets and some liabilities. When I say the US, I actually mean the Trump administration specifically, because I believe no deal can be reached without American engagement, but can Trump be it? When Trump came in, he came with a lot of assets. The first asset was the fact, as you mentioned, Geoffrey, that he's not Obama. Obama was seen by many traditional allies in the region as someone, as a leader who was taking America out of the region, as a leader who wanted to make friends with America's enemies, Iran in particular, at the expense of America's friends. Trump comes in, has a rhetoric that's very different, that reaffirms old alliances, as you said, doesn't hit domestic issues. The region was happy. And we saw the reception that he received when he went to the region. The region was ecstatic. So that was one asset. The other asset was geostrategic. Iran has emerged as the main threat, not only to Israel, but also to the Saudis, to the Gulf, to the Jordanians, etc. There is a confluence of interest. These are the assets. And that's why Trump came with very high expectations. Yet these assets are diminishing by the minute. Because the region is seeing that actually, despite the good talk, we're not acting. And they look at what's happening in the crisis between Qatar and the rest of the Gulf. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Mixed messages from Washington, tough talk, no action, lack of addresses, there's no staff, do we know who's in charge, etc., etc. So while people are hopeful, and I still think there's an opportunity, unless we deal with these issues, unless we have clarity of policy and back our words with action, soon we will very quickly lose that. And in the Middle East, there is no sin bigger than being seen as weak and ineffectual. And we're heading in that direction. If the US, if we fix some of these issues, if we change our priority from looking at the ultimate deal, which is, I believe, unachievable, and go into a more practical approach, we might not be able to get peace. Yet I believe we can move the needle, and we may start being able to create conditions that might get us at some point to peace, but we cannot have it all or nothing. If it's all or nothing, I fear that we'll get nothing.
Thank you both very, very much. And I think to get this sort of dialogue going, I'll ask both of you a difficult question, but I'm certain you can answer it or try to. If there were one issue that you think Jared Kushner could help on when it comes to Israel, what, Shai, would you recommend he do as a priority? And well, let's forget about the reality of this and who would accompany him, but if you had half an hour with them and limited time and limited engagement, one issue that you really think the Americans under Trump could do to help, what would it be? And the same question for you, what would you tell Jared Kushner to do for the Palestinians?
So actually, I wrote 3 articles about what the Trump administration could do. And the first paragraph of the first of these 3 articles, in a way, suggested that Jared Kushner step aside. But this was not facetious, actually. The article argued that, in my view, the key is General Mattis and not Jared Kushner. And the reason why General Mattis, why the Secretary of Defense is the key, goes back to the point that I made on Monday. To get the support for the concessions, the risks that Israel has to take to achieve peace, the fears of the center of the Israeli political map have to be addressed. And the key here is security. And the key here is the role of the American defense community. Just like the American defense community was a key in its engagement with the Israeli defense community over the Iran nuclear issue, the American defense community is the key here as well. There has to be the only country that the United States ultimately trusts is the United States. The only alliance that the Israelis regard as a real alliance is the alliance with the United States. And so only a security plan that will persuade the Israeli public that there are ways of addressing the risks, that there are ways of mitigating the downsides, let's call it this way, of the concessions that would need to be made, and that the United States is willing to engage with the Israeli defense community on how to mitigate these security threats. That is the only. Now, we are also, let me tie this also to the point that you made in your opening comments and a comment that Rafe made. This is tied to a very important change in the region, which is to say, it happens to be that in the last 2 or 3 years, there emerges a larger confluence of security interests between Israel and key players in the region, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates. They are united around the threat of Sunni extremist Islam, primarily ISIS, and Iran. That means that there may be, for the first time, a willingness in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in the Emirates, to engage in a broader conversation that the United States has to lead about how these regional parties would play a role in addressing the security concerns that Israel has about the concessions that would need to be made for a deal to be concluded. So in that sense as well, I think that we have an opportunity here. The problem that we have is that I mentioned the opportunity we had in 91, 92, 93, 94. The luck that we had to do with a personality I didn't mention, which is we had an architect. Actually, it was kind of an alliance between two architects, President H.W. Bush and his emissary to the region, Jim Baker. We don't have a Jim Baker right now for a whole host of reasons. We don't have an architect to put together the design that I think is the key. But all goes back to the story, that the key in my view is the American defense community, and therefore it's not Jared Kushner.
So in other words, your advice to Jared Kushner would be call Mattis, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
I actually would advise him the exact opposite. I would say stick with it. Look, this is a region that understands instinctively almost the power of familial relations. King Salman has just appointed his 31-year-old son as Crown Prince of Saudi. This is a region that understands that. However, this is a potential. This is not yet a full asset. He has to show the region that his father-in-law gave him the job because he trusts him and thinks he can succeed, not because he hates him and thinks he's going to fail. Meaning, show you can deliver the president. If you show you can deliver the president, then a lot will come from that. Part of Baker's strength, part of Condi Rice's strength, part of many of these figures in American history, their strength is the fact that they were clearly speaking for the president and could deliver the president when he was needed. Once you've done that, then you have to move to the next step. The next step is show that you understand the issues and understand the Palestinians. Don't abandon U.S.-Israel relations. It's an asset, but so that you show that you understand the legitimacy of some of the concerns and interests of the Palestinians. Once you show that, I think you can start then making the demands. And for me, the demands will be two. One, you have to push the Palestinians on reform. This is something that I think is key. I think without reform, whether it's civil, whether it's governance, whether it's security, whether it's political, it's very hard to see how the Palestinian body politic can move forward. And second, I think you have to make a difficult ask of the Palestinians, just like you have to make from the Israelis. You have to ask the Palestinians to stop incitement. You do it as a threat, but also you offer reward. I'm asking you to do something difficult. Once you do it, as you do it, these are the goodies that will come with that. Create this sense of, balance of reward and pressure. Show that you can deliver. Show that you are serious. Show that you can understand the issues. I think he will actually have a lot of leeway that he can use.
Good. Okay. Shai, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll make two comments. One is I actually believed largely 6 months ago some of what Wraith said. The problem is that I see is that the chances of Jared Kushner at the present time to enjoy the kind of backing and trust and strength that Jim Baker was able to derive from his relationship with H.W. and Condi Rice was able to derive from her relationship with George W. It's very difficult to see how that can happen under the present circumstances of these various investigations. Jim Baker and Condi Rice, to my memory, did not have a different fear that we haven't talked about on Monday and Tuesday, and that's the fear of grand juries. And I would say, and the other thing that I would say is, it's very difficult for me to see how this administration, compared to previous administrations, including the George W. administration that talked a lot about reform. I mean, right in June 2002, Palestinian reform was the center of George W.'s speech. This administration is going to push the Palestinians to reform. This administration is going to push the Palestinians to fight corruption. I'm a little skeptical.
Well, how would you reply to that?
On the first one, I think, look, the problem is not with Kushner specifically.
Yeah, I know.
It's a structural issue. And I think in that sense, whether it's Mattis, whether it's McMaster, whether it is Tillerson, whether whoever it is, until we give a sense to the Palestinians, the Israelis, the region, the world, that we have our house in order, I believe no foreign policy initiative that we can take will actually fly. We might have interventions, but we can't have policies. That's one. On the second one, you ask a hypothetical, so I answer the hypothetical. Yeah. What do I think realistically they can do? I'm not very optimistic. The track record so far has not been very optimistic, but in a perfect world, I would like them to do that. In an imperfect world, the best I can say is do no harm, don't raise expectations, do what can be done, make sure security cooperation continues, pump some money into it, but do no harm, don't go big and then fail.
Now, the reality is that if you look at the history, the thing that has usually gotten presidents involved, not just in general terms, but in the nitty-gritty, has been a crisis. And there are many, evidence of crises that could occur in the Middle East. I mean, this trouble we had in Jerusalem recently could have gotten out of hand, and it seems to me no one knows how the Trump administration or any other administration would have reacted, but it would have forced them to do more than they're doing today. And therefore, I just wonder to what extent, we have to wait for things to get worse before they get better.
I disagree with that, Geoffrey. I think your general observation was correct, but with one very important caveat. It's not just the crisis. It's the fact that the crisis was at the top of the international agenda. We would not have had a peace process with Egypt without the crisis that the 73 war created, right? And I think it's Kissinger who said that every crisis is also the door to an opportunity. Mm-hmm. But the 73 war was at the top of the global agenda. And the same applies to the crisis that, as I said, led to the golden era in Arab-Israeli peacemaking. The Gulf War was at the top of the global agenda. And my view is that even Jerusalem, I don't see, and even, by the way, if we had a full-scale, put it this way, the kind of quote-unquote war that we had either with Hezbollah in 2006 or the 3 wars that Israel had with Hamas in the last 10 years. These are not, neither of these confrontations are going to climb to the top of the global agenda. None of them can compete in terms of their global implications and the implications for US interests and security with places like North Korea. So in a situation where we are now in the midst, as I'm sure that many of you were in Dame Remington's talk this morning, we are in the midst of a huge international crisis. I think she was right to compare it. It's basically a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis, okay? But look at where the energies of the National Security Council, of the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, where are they sucked into? They're sucked into Asia, not the Middle East, because nothing in the Middle East today can threaten America's interests to the extent that Asia threatens now, and the Middle East did in the 1970s and the early 90s.
I mean, it's not always true. Not you, Geoffrey, not Shai. You're always true. You're always right. No, I mean, in the sense that, look, we've seen crises that actually did the exact opposite. When George W. Bush came into the White House, we were in the middle, actually, of an intifada. Things was an active conflict. His reaction to that was a pox on both your houses, in some sense, or more accurately, full support of Sharon and disengagement of that. And he actually took him a while to warm up to the issue, and that was really after the crisis was almost past. So I think different leaders relate to crises in different ways. The Jerusalem crisis that we had, to me, is actually an example of how not to do it as the United States. We were absent. We were utterly absent. Mattis against the, Tillerson, against the urging of his staff, refused to call anyone because he felt he was not in charge. There was no one in charge in the White House until eventually Kushner got convinced to call King Abdullah of Jordan, and he got the facts wrong in that conversation. We sent the US envoy, Jason Greenblatt, who is a very serious guy and a very methodical guy, well into the crisis. We were not present on the ground. We had no ambassador in Jordan, and all of that. And in the end, while the crisis was diffused, it was diffused in very suboptimal ways. Because we were not the architects of that, I believe what it bred is a new crisis, which is a major diplomatic crisis that's brewing now between Jordan and Israel. If the US, in my view, is not there in a capable, high-level enough way to manage these crises, and if we trust the region to resolve it on its own, we might be lucky. We have some responsible leaders who might do it, but often we're not as lucky, and often things go out of hand. If you're absent, things always go in a way that is outside your control.
Right. Well, I mean, I think those are two very good points that you've both made here. Just as a sort of footnote, poor Obama, everyone that you talk to who understands Israeli-US military and intelligence relations will tell you that they were never better than during the Obama administration. And to that extent, Mattis is drawing upon a lot of goodwill and brotherhood that's been built up over the years, and Obama deserves some credit for it. So now let me ask you both another question before we turn it open to the audience.
Can I just confirm what you said?
You could, yes, but I'm very happy to have you confirm what I said.
The three articles that I mentioned were preceded by an article that I wrote when Obama left office on January 20, to set the record straight, because I think that Obama did not get, and still doesn't get, the credit that he deserves for the closest ever. The thing is that people in their mindset somehow were successful in creating this kind of divide in their minds between the close cooperation between Israel and the United States in the defense and intelligence realm, and President Obama. And they forgot one tiny, tiny item, which is President Obama was the commander-in-chief. None of what happened in the realm of intelligence cooperation and defense cooperation would have happened without the support and the green light of the commander-in-chief. And therefore, Obama deserves huge credit, and I will say even more than that. The reason why Obama was successful vis-a-vis Israel, remember Obama basically had two issues that he engaged with Israel during these, especially during the last 4 years, the second term. One is the Iran nuclear issue, and the second is the attempt to move the Israeli-Palestinian front forward. He succeeded in his goal on the Iran issue, which was to prevent Israel to attack militarily the Iranian nuclear installations that would have sabotaged the nuclear agreement with Iran. Now, how did he do that? He did it because the relationship between Israel and the United States in the defense and intelligence realm became so close that the argument, the winning argument in Israel was not about what are the risks, regional risks, and so on and so forth that would be associated with attacking the Iranian nuclear installation. It was about what cost Israel would pay in the very close, very superb relationship in the defense realm that were established between Israel and the United States. Obama succeeded in creating a vested Israeli interest in the maintenance of this alliance, and he could only have achieved that with the close relationship, the close defense and intelligence relationship that he supported.
Thank you. I think this is a very important point for the history books. So, last sort of general question to you both before we open up to the audience. Both of you have stressed on Monday, Tuesday, and now Wednesday that one of the critical flaws is the leadership in both cases. So, Raif, let's start with you. Tell us what hope is there for getting a new set of leaders who can, to some extent, make the type of commitment to peace that you think many people in the Palestinian areas would like, but just don't trust their leaders at the moment to obtain?
That's a difficult one.
Yes.
Let me maybe start with a statement of faith, which I mentioned yesterday and I will repeat. Analysis aside, often great leaders emerge when you least expect them, from the quarters that you least expect. Someone's history doesn't always predict their future, and that's the story of Sadat, Rabin, Sharon, Arafat, and many of these leaders. So keeping that in mind, keeping the black swan scenario in mind, I believe that there's no way right now that you can produce, that the Palestinian system can produce a Palestinian legitimate leader unless you can revive politics within Palestine. And for me, Arafat was a very flawed leader in many, many ways. And we can spend many times talking about that. But in one way, he was actually a good leader in the sense that he created a system and a dynamic around him where, it is quite appealing as a young, active, energetic, talented political actor to come in and try to prove yourself because you might quickly be picked up and become senior. And he surrounded himself with a very diverse group that included almost everyone so that everyone felt that they had a stake in the political process. Abbas did the exact opposite. He turned the Fatah party, which is the main backbone of the Palestinian national movement, to something similar to the Communist Party at the last days of the Soviet Union. Very bureaucratic, very patronage-based, etc. As long as you have this kind of politics, and by the way, this did not allow anyone to practice politics outside that system. Hamas has its own issues. Until you change this reality, until you have a system that allows a political process to happen, it is very hard to imagine how a Palestinian leader will emerge. I fear that we are moving to a situation that reminds me of the late 1930s, where the Palestinian leadership was very similar, did not allow for a new leadership to emerge, and what had to happen then was for this leadership to collapse as a result of the 1948 war, and it took us a generation for a new leadership to emerge. Unless we open up the political space, make politics appealing again to Palestinians, I fear that the only way that you have a new leadership is for this one to collapse and you want to emerge, but that is a very disruptive, ugly, and potentially bloody process.
Wow. Okay, now that's fine. Shai, the front page of the New York Times today, for the first time in a long time, I saw something that just suggested, mind you, that Benjamin Netanyahu is in real trouble. Could you tell us a little about what would happen if Netanyahu does not survive as prime minister? Do things get better or do they get worse?
In the short run, worse. Because I don't think that if in the short run, if he is set aside and no other changes take place, then he will be replaced by somebody from his party, and his party has only moved to the right. This is a process that began about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when Sharon left Likud and created a center party and took all the centrists and all the pragmatists that were in Likud, to the extent that there were some, to create this party. And so Likud basically became a much more right-wing party than before. And right now, Netanyahu is not challenged by anybody at the center or the left of center for the reasons that we talked about on Monday. The center and the left of center remains paralyzed. He's challenged by the right, and he's challenged by people who are to the right of him. And so I don't see in the short range any positive improvement. I think that the challenge is on the Israeli side is similar to what Rafe described on the Palestinian side. And this has nothing to do with ideology. This just has to do with whether we are able to persuade young, talented people to enter into public life. I think I mentioned this on Monday. I think that Israel is now afflicted by the same malignancy that you see in places like Great Britain and the US, where people who have become spectacular success stories in the private sector look at politics and run away from that as fast and as far as they can. And here we have to recognize that we, all of us who cherish democracy, have a real problem that we have to grapple with, which is that free press is a pillar of democracy, a stronger pillar than all these pillars, and we have to cherish that pillar. But there is a but here that some of you who just applauded will not be happy to hear, which is everything. I was mentored by a retired general that one of the slogans I learned from him is everything in good measure. Okay, everything in good measure. And the problem is that we in Israel face, in the US I think faces, in Great Britain for sure, is that this freedom has been taken to an extreme. We are faced with the problem of a brutality of the media. And that brutality of the media that essentially almost guarantees to anybody who dares enter public life that the minute you enter public life, there is no dividing line between your private life and your public life. That is a cost that very few successful young people are willing to pay. And until we somehow address this, and it can't be addressed legally, it has to be addressed by self-constraints, where the media begins to behave more responsibly, I think it's very difficult for me to see how we will have, once again, a critical mass of talented young people that entered public life in the 1940s and 50s and 60s to enter once again public life, so that the answer to your question, Geoffrey, will be positive rather than negative.
Well, on these two very somber but very, I think, sort of brilliant analyses, let's thank our speakers very much. And let's have some questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. The usual rules apply. I hope we can get to all of you, but we may not. So let's start over here.
I want to thank the speakers for their hard work and for their passion and for the good work, good thought they put into this. It seems to me that a lot of times we approach the issues from the top down. We say, how can we get better leaders? You know, and I'd like to look at it from the bottom up. You raised the issue of Gaza. The United Nations has said that by the year 2020, Gaza will be uninhabitable. Their drinking water is getting so low that it might become salt water. Their sewage system is bad because it was bombed and Israel won't allow them to repair it. Their healthcare system is deteriorating. We're going to have a real crisis with real people whose faces we can see. And I think that one of the issues is that we have been denied the ability to see the face of the other. And in Israel, so many Israelis don't even see Palestinians. So many Palestinians don't even see Israelis. They don't exist. Okay. So how can this crisis help us see each other first? And secondly, how can we aggregate the power in this space here? Because there are a lot of silent voices, because people are afraid to speak. They don't want to challenge what's happening in Israel. How can we aggregate the power to make our leaders better, rather than to try to change them?
Thank you very much. So, Rafe, that's really in your court.
Two quick points. One about Gaza. I mean, I fully agree with what you said. It's a humanitarian travesty. It is, though, fair to say and to allocate the blame on everyone who has blame. Israel has its share of the blame. The Palestinian Authority has its share of the blame. Egypt, but also Hamas, that by not willing to moderate and move, has also holding the public hostage, and so that's what makes it so complicated. But I agree with you, something has to be done about it for humanitarian reasons first and foremost, but also to prevent a new war. But the second question that you point is actually, to me, is one of the most both depressing and uplifting points. Depressing in the following sense. When I first moved to Palestine, to Ramallah in 1997, I think I mentioned it yesterday. First time I personally met an Israeli was in my early 20s, and I thought Israelis until that point were all evil, horns and tails, and all of the kind of almost anti-Semitic tropes that you can imagine. And I started meeting real Israelis and realized that they are real people like everyone else. They are good, they are bad, they are indifferent, etc. I moved to Ramallah and found out that all Palestinians and most Palestinians and most Israelis interacted. There were no stereotypes. As things moved with time, the societies are separated. They don't meet one another. And when they do, it's in the worst circumstances. A Palestinian only meets an Israeli at a checkpoint, and that's never a good experience. And the Israelis have their own gripes. Now, in the 90s, we had something called people-to-people programs, which frankly, at that point, I thought were superfluous and a waste of money. Why spend money on something that's organically happening? Today, we have to support it. And when I say uplifting, this is where I find the uplifting side. There are so many courageous Palestinians and Israelis, not people like me and Shai who are comfortably here, courageous Palestinian and Israelis on the ground who want to do it. We have to help them. How do we help them? We help them financially, for sure, when we can. We help them by pushing our government to push their governments not to penalize them. The Palestinians have something called the anti-normalization movement that socially and politically penalizes people who engage with Israelis. In Israel, there's a move to stigmatize left-wing NGOs, non-governmental organizations that engage in this work. We have to push against it. What we can do here is the following. Some of this unfortunate dynamic has found its way to the United States. On campuses, this issue is defined by the most shrill voices on either side, and most people are afraid to engage. When we find people who are willing to engage, we should support them. Those of us who are older, more established, who are authority figures in our communities, should go to their kids, and these are kids, and tell them what you're doing is right. Give them the moral support, give them the political support, give them the space. I think we can do a lot of good if we start countering the divisive nature of the conversation, not only there, but also here.
Okay, so we do have a lot of people. We do not have a lot of time. Please make your questions short and to the point. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I would like to ask the gentleman to speak on a note of optimism. Forget the leaders for a minute. Within a month ago, the Jordanians, the Palestinians, and the Israelis signed a mutual agreement to build the Red Dead pipeline to draw water from the Red Sea over Jordanian territory into a desalination plant, 2 power plants, and the water that is created will be distributed to Jordan, to the Palestinians, and to Israel. Now, this didn't get a lot, but I saw a picture of the 6 men shaking hands. We don't hear about that, but there are things on the ground below the level you've been talking about. I'd like to hear what Shai and what Ghaith knows about that project.
That's a good point. To try?
Well, you've outlined the project. Let me just underscore the main point you made, which is the story is not all bad. The story is not all negative. There are developments of the kind that you mentioned. It's not the only development. Actually, the news in the last 48 hours is that finally, through the Egyptian system, the approvals have been received for Egypt to purchase, for the first time, natural gas from Israel. So these things are happening, and they are happening exactly because of. But we remember, for these positive economic developments to mature and to be implemented, you do have to depend on a positive strategic geopolitical environment. If it wasn't for the development that I mentioned earlier, the fact that we now live in an era in which there are common security strategic interests to Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, you would not have seen either of these 2 projects that have been, by the way, in the pipeline for years from materializing. Therefore, we have to remember that as important as these bottom-up, people-to-people things are, we still depend on the grand strategic environment to allow positive breakthroughs to come forward.
Thank you very much. And by the way, last year, one of the issues we discussed here was the extraordinary environmental crises that many Middle Eastern countries face, particularly water shortages. And this is where Israel has a great deal to offer. So, yes.
Thank you. We learned on Monday from Dan Ariely that people react more strongly to stories about individuals. We have a lot of conversation about history here, but I have in mind these instances. They're hard to hear. The settler woman who kindly, astutely observed a Palestinian farmer filling bottles of water and loading them on his donkey so that he can water his crops while the settler woman's children enjoy a swimming pool. The Palestinian young women who were not able to accept international scholarships because Israel controls their coming and going. The Israeli soldiers who boasted about deliberately detaining and harassing Palestinians at a checkpoint.
Do you have a
And
question?
more.
Do you have a question?
How do such situations promote peace and security? How do they display regard?
Okay, right. Go ahead.
Look, it is very, there are many, in the nature of the conflict and occupation, there are many of such tragic stories. And if you had an Israeli, they also tell you about the story of that settler family that was killed in their home a few days ago, and the suicide bombings and all of that. There are enough grievances there. These are grievances that we should not ignore and we should recognize, but at the same time, if we only focus on the negative, if we only focus on that, we will continue recreating the sense of fear and the sense of tragedy and the sense of futility. So I believe as we should recognize these things, we should also move forward in a positive direction.
Thank you, Graf. And no more, I think we'll get to all of you, but no more people join the line, please, if we're to get through this list.
One of the issues over the years has been the recognition of Israel's, quote, right to exist. And I would like to hear a distinction between the recognition of the right to exist and the recognition of their existence. Is there not a distinction there, and is it not relevant in dealing with Hamas and Gaza?
Shai?
I think the distinction that arose in the last few years was not that distinction. The distinction was between recognizing Israel and recognizing Israel, and now there are a couple of versions of that, Israel as a Jewish state, Israel as a home of the Jewish people, okay? This is the caveat that Prime Minister Netanyahu added in the last few years. Now, there are various interpretations of why he added that caveat. I would just say this, which is that asking the Palestinians to recognize Israel as the home of the Jewish people is asking the Palestinians to adopt the Israeli narrative, which opens the whole question of the relationship between conflict resolution and getting each side to accept the other side's narrative. I am a very strong proponent of the South African approach to this, which is first, resolve the political conflict, right? In the case of South Africa, it was ending apartheid. After apartheid ended, the two sides created something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was tasked with bringing the narratives closer to and hopefully creating an accepted common narrative. So that's one issue. The second issue is now I think that one of the things that came out from these discussions in the last 2-3 days that there is a utility in making things personal. So let me just say, from my personal standpoint, as an Israeli who served in the military and served in reserve service for 20 years, as a fifth-generation Israeli, if you asked Ben Gurion to make the success of the Zionist project contingent on the Palestinians accepting our narrative, he would have basically said, are you insane? The whole idea of Zionism is self-help, which is we define for ourselves our state, its purpose, its values, its construct. Why do we need somebody else's permission to create the state that we want? All we need is the other state, the other parties to accept us, okay? We did not demand this from the Egyptians in 1979 when we signed the peace treaty. We did not demand this from Arafat in the Oslo Accords. And we did not demand this from the Jordanians in the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. There is no reason, in my view, to demand from the other side other than that the other side accepts us. And there is no such thing as two sides signing a treaty without each side accepting the other side.
Okay, thank you very much. Scott. Yes, sir.
Shai, you underscored the importance for the Israelis for potentially making peace, that they need to feel secure, that there's a security issue that has to be handled. And Netanyahu came to this country and he's emphatically said that Iran represents a mortal threat, the biggest mortal threat to Israel. And we made an agreement with Iran. We gave them billions of dollars, hundreds of billions. And they, I believe, still remain a destabilizing, the biggest destabilizing force in the Middle East. How is this going to affect Israel's sense of confidence and security in the long run?
Okay, the quick answer, Shai.
Well, look, the quick answer I think I gave on Monday, which is Zionism is all about conquering your threats, okay? Conquering your fears, okay? And Iran is not the only element if you want to build an equation of the threats that Israel faces. But we have to remember what is the consequence of essentially letting these threats paralyze us in what we need to do to resolve our conflict with the Palestinians. If we let these fears paralyze us, then the demographic trajectory and the fact that Israel already controls these Palestinians for 50 years now, okay, would not allow Israel indefinitely to claim that it is a Jewish and democratic state. This is, and as I said, we live in an unforgiving environment in which we have to balance risks and address them. And the last thing that Israel can afford to do, in my view, is allow risks like Iran to paralyze us from what we need to do to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Thank you. Next. Yes, sir.
I know you've talked about the region and the instability of the region and how the world has changed in terms of the nations in the Arab world. But it strikes me with the discussion of Gaza that while Gaza has an enormous crisis, it's been eclipsed by the crisis in Syria and Daesh, and we're anesthetized almost to the terrible consequences of what's going on. So that seeing images of Gaza and its crisis is just another crisis in a region that's gone off the rails. And it's a very disturbing, I don't know where the hope is there, but it's a very disturbing point. And in today's Haaretz, just on another note, it seems that Netanyahu and his family are...
Okay, guys, would you like to sort of address that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, yes, we have been anesthetized in many ways, some in terms of compassion, in more concrete terms, in terms of the diplomatic priority, and in humanitarian terms, in terms of allocating resources. Almost natural, almost inevitable, and will continue until we have the next war in Gaza, at which point it will come back to the forefront. It's tragic, but unless we start dealing with these issues now, a war is inevitable, and when war happens, not only the humanitarian, but also the destabilizing aspect of that war will force us to deal with it, but on terms that we do not choose, but terms that are imposed on us.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. As settlement growth continues in the West Bank as we speak, it seems like the possibility of a two-state solution becomes more difficult as the West Bank would be harder to divide. Would you speak to how the peace process will have to change over the coming years as the physical landscape changes in the West Bank in regards to population? Would you also talk about the merits and possibilities of a one-state solution with full and equal rights for Palestinians?
Well, we're not going to get to all that, but they're very good questions. Shai, have a quick go at that.
I already answered this question. I mean,
I'll have a quick,
yes.
if I may. On settlements, 2 quick points. While I actually don't think the settlement growth makes the physical viability of a two-state solution impossible. Because at the end of the day, it's counted into the formula of what we call land swaps that we need to resolve the conflict. The problem with settlement development or growth is different. Remember I said how the Palestinians should stop incitement because that sends a message to the Israelis that they're not serious about peace? Settlement sends the strongest message to Palestinians that Israelis are not serious. It has to be stopped for that reason. One state, impossible for a simple reason. You have two nationalisms, two national identities, two national movements. Each wants its own fulfillment in its own state. Put them together, you'll turn it from an international conflict into a civil war because the Palestinians will not want to live in a Jewish state and the Israeli Jews do not want to live in a Palestinian state.
Okay, so we're down to the last two, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to ask your question and then hold it, and then the gentleman here will ask his question, and then the two guests will wrap up this very interesting session. Yes, sir.
I've been really, really impressed by by both of you and the intellectual honesty that you brought to the dialogue, and your ability to see the subtleties and the complexities and articulate each other's points of view. My question, thank you for that. My question is, to what degree do you see your populations, both the people, the government, the educational system, able to do what you did so well here? Because without that, with what you did, you could solve it here, we could finish by 5 and be done. Without the ability for a deeper engagement in the kind of subtleties that you've spoken to, there's not much hope.
Very good question. Yes, sir.
I'll be very, very brief. Before Jared Kushner, we had George Mitchell, Tony Blair trying to solve the problem. What happened? I don't even know what happened with those guys. Can you kind of address that for a minute?
Okay. Well, now, which of those questions would you like to take?
I'll take the first.
Shai will take the first. You will deal with the Jared Kushner question.
Thank you.
I think you know the answer, but let me phrase it in the following, which is, so part of this is what Rafe said earlier, which is very few, and that particularly applies to the younger generation, very few Palestinians know Israelis, and very few Israelis know Palestinians. So now if you ask beyond that, which is, how many Palestinians really understand what makes Israelis tick, and how many Israelis really understand what makes Palestinians tick, the number is even more limited. The problem you see in the populations exercising the same kind of, the word that I would use here is empathy, okay? I have met and interacted and worked with Arab colleagues like Rafe for over 40 years. And surprisingly enough, after a whole day of negotiations, you actually have dinner, and after the dinner you retire somewhere, and then people talk about their personal lives. And you get to know people as people. And then you begin to empathize with the problems and the challenges that they face on a daily life. So if I take the period 2000, the first 5 years of the Intifada, it's Israelis' understanding of the difficulties that the average Palestinian faces when he has to cross a checkpoint and roadblock. And for the Palestinian, during the same period, it's empathy towards the Israeli who has a 15-year-old daughter and who has to worry about whether she can allow her daughter to go to a coffee shop or to a mall because she's afraid that there will be a suicide bomber there. So it's that empathy that's missing. Now, on the national level, however, it's much more difficult. And the reason it's difficult, it's very difficult to ask, again, as long as the conflict is there, for both sides to essentially understand, accept the other side's narrative, is that as long as conflicts exist, narratives are a weapon. And especially the weaker side is afraid to disarm itself of this weapon that it perceives that it's one of its only weapons available to it. And so there is this tendency to defend the weapon, that weapon called the narrative, and not yield on this. And that's why, I and another Palestinian colleague and another Egyptian colleague published 3 years ago the first university textbook on the Arab-Israeli conflict that's co-authored by an Israeli, a Palestinian, and an Egyptian. And that is now used last year in 30 classrooms in American universities, okay? But for the Israeli Ministry of Defense and for the Palestinian Ministry of Defense to allow, a Ministry of Education in both cases, to allow classrooms in Palestine and in Israel to adopt this textbook is impossible because they still adhere to their narrative. I once had a conversation with a minister from Likud. I came back from some conference where I had the opportunity to interact with my Arab colleagues. Some issue came up, and the minister from Likud said something. And I said, I'm not very confrontational. So I said, that's a very interesting position you took. Maybe you might be interested in the fact that in that the Arabs, at least those that I just met in the last week, have a different perspective on this issue that you just raised. And that minister said to me, Shai, I don't want to know their perspective, okay? And why? Because she felt that until the conflict is resolved, Israel has to adhere to its narrative and not to yield its narrative. And the same, unfortunately, reaction we get from the leadership level of the other side. So to expect at the leadership and the political level to see what we can exercise here, I think, unfortunately, is unrealistic. I wish it wasn't, but unfortunately, I think it's unrealistic.
Thank you, Shai. The last word comes to you in the answering that very tough question.
Well, actually, I can quickly go through what they're doing. Tony Blair is still trying to broker a regional peace deal between Israel and Arab countries. George Mitchell just wrote a book about the peace process and is talking about it. Martin Indyk, who was Obama's peace envoy, is now back in Brookings working on this issue. Dennis Ross, who was Clinton's peace envoy, is my colleague at the Washington Institute working on this issue. The question you ask yourself, why are they still working on this issue? These are not, people who need a job. These are not people who are, shall I say it, stupid, who cannot see the complexity of it. Yet you see these people who are still committed and trying to resolve it. Why? Many reasons. Partly because of actually what both of you in the front mentioned. On a human level, this is both tragic but also uplifting. What we talked about on a policy level, it's so alluring. You know the solution, but you don't know how to get to it.
Right.
On a personal level, this is something, we can look at it as a normal geostrategic issue, and it's that, of course, but it's more than that. It's about the Holy Land. It's about history. It's about identities. So this is an issue that, as much as many people would like to say it's passé, the issue has moved on, it's an issue that remains able to mobilize people. It's an issue that can move people. Actually, the challenge to all of us right now is, what kind of people will we allow to mobilize? Will we allow to mobilize the very divisive, shrill voices out there? Or do we help to make it mobilize the more peace-oriented voices? For me, one of the, I come to these kind of things, to enjoy the scenery and all of that. But it's also very energizing to see that there is a community out there that's still interested in peace. One that we don't always see in Washington in our conversations. So for that, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. But please, as I asked you before, when you find young people who want to engage, encourage them, help them, because ultimately that's how we move forward. So thank you again, and it was really a pleasure.
Thanks to both of you.